Okay, could we start, please? Let me remind you, the last session in this series is in a fortnight on the 22nd, and Jonas Dahlberg will be the speaker. You'll find the information on the website. Today, Anne Lislegaard is talking. She's coming to do this talk, and I'm very pleased. In a recent exhibition titled The Time Machine, which was shown in Murray Guy Gallery in New York, she showed two installations which included sound, broken fragmented language, light, mirrors, digital animation, and architectural interventions. This is a description I got from the gallery website, but I think this description would cover most of her work, though sometimes there aren't mirrors and sometimes there's silence. But the title, The Time Machine, which is obviously a reference to H.G. Wells, is not the only title that marks her involvement with science fiction. She has done a show called The Crystal World, which is J.G. Ballard, The Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin. When I invited Anne to speak, she immediately pointed out that the 8th of March is Women's Day. And she asked if there would be a lecture at the AA to mark that. I do not know what she has chosen to speak about today. When I asked her for images to go on the AA website, she sent me a great choice of images, and the last one was the cover of a comic strip, Wonder Woman, number 203. I had, of course, no choice at this point. Wonder Woman it was. Maybe you've seen it on the website. But I have only just noticed that it was the Women's Lib issue. At that point, I realized that it was an issue edited by the science fiction writer Samuel Delany. Add to this that she had titled a 2005 work, Bellona, after Samuel R. Delany. I wonder, has Anne gone further? Are we going to be lucky enough to hear about work around Diana Prince, Wonder Woman? Anne has shown her work in Oslo and Copenhagen, in Detroit, Seattle, and New York. And she did have a show which unfortunately I didn't know about at Raven Row in London in 2009. I would like you to welcome Anne.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope I won't displease you, but thank you so much for the invitation. It's been looking very much forward to be here and to be back in London. And today I saw Joan Saund's museum, which is really such an interesting place. Heterotopic place, I would almost call it. So anyway, this is a brief peek into Ursula Le Guin's City of Illusion. And I'll just start. So I will show you a few 3D animations, an earthwork, and the sound installation. Most of these works will bring forward ideas from science fiction as an alternative approach to language and narration, gender roles, politics, and of course, cosmologies and concepts of the future. Science fiction is a literature of cognitive estrangement, a genre of defamiliarization that can place the reader in a world different from our own in ways that stimulate thought about the nature of those differences and can cause us to view our present world from an alternative perspective. It is a laboratory where all kinds of possibilities and scenarios can be tested and staged and put into play. And here we see Mary Shelley's film, Frankenstein, from Mary Shelley's 1818 book or novel. Can you hear me? Is sounds and everything okay? So here you see it. And it is the 8th of March today. And yeah, it's an important day. In Norway, they celebrate 100 years of being able to vote. So, well, in this way, science fiction also has a highly subversive potential. It can create a space for critical reflection on reality and power, gender roles and sexuality, for speculations about the unknown and our ever-elusive future, and for speculation about what can be imagined. Due to this speculative potential, science fiction is often related to utopia. My interest in this comes less from Thomas More's idea of an ideal community or society possessing a perfect socio-political and legal system, a good place, which is a no place. Instead, I find Foucault's heterotopia more relevant. The heterotopias of time, such as museums, or the heterotopias of compensation, spaces that are other. Another example that Foucault uses to illustrate his idea is a garden, which can be a heterotopia since it's a real place that juxtaposes several spaces or environments with plants from all around the world, which I find relevant in relation to my work, Crystal World. And here you can see the book jacket, which Mark spoke so nicely about just before. Max Ernst's book jacket, Eye of Silence, for J.G. Ballard's first edition. So my animation, Crystal World, might be seen as a garden of some sort. In the piece, there are the crystalline growth and several other juxtaposed spaces of plants, but more so of artworks and architectural worlds. And I'll do a short outline and show you some images. And as you noted before, these two screens are usually tilted towards the wall, just so you have an idea when you look at it. So Crystal World, with the title Crystal World after J.G. Ballard, is a double-channel projection first shown at the São Paulo Biennial in 2006. In the 3D animation, a universe, world, or cosmos is constructed with architecture elements and a jungle that slowly crystallizes. A text generated from a letter written by the protagonist Sander in J.G. Ballard's novel describes a zone of entropy, a process of transformation and crystallization. The animation moves through spaces combining architecture elements of Lina Bobardi's Casa di Vidro and Oscar Niemeyer's Materazzo Pavilion, both built in São Paulo. So when I first visited São Paulo doing a research trip, I had Ballard's book with me and was struck by the melting in my mind of these two versions of the future, one in book form and one in the form of Brazilian modernist architecture, which became important for my animation, Crystal World. And as you can see here, there is the text, and you will continuously see it, is always on the right screen. And the two screens are not in sync with each other, which means that next time you will read the text in that next loop, so to speak, there will be another image next to the text, so that the idea of the read of the text will always point to a different kind of scenario. And it will probably take around 31 hours to see exactly these two imageries together again. So, of course, you will not have the chance to see it for that long, but this means that also when you come back, seeing it again and again, maybe, it will always have a different kind of tone. And the meaning of the text will continuously change. So some artworks from other artists are animated in this 3D space or universe cosmos. The novel Crystal World has many ties to art from the 60s and early 70s. Robert Smithson quoted the Crystal World in his writings and was interested in some of the themes like the idea of temporality, crystals, mirrors, and entropy. Besides Smithson, The Dead Tree from 1969, I've included Untitled Road Piece by Eva Hesse and other references which, together with the architectural elements, are reactivated in the animation as sort of characters. In this way, ideas of temporality, time, entropy, and transformation in late modernity is played out in what could be termed a mental landscape or sort of matrix. Yes, and as you can see, some of the images are almost black and others are blended with light. Yeah. And as you can see, this is the Dead Tree of Smithson. It was shown in Düsseldorf in '69. And you can see the tree is leaning on the mirrors. And here, as you saw in the animation, it's placed in the architecture. And here, as you can see, one of the characters, as I call it, is lying there on the ground floor. So, and also showing how interestingly 3D can be. With a click on the mouse, you can somehow take away all corners and walls and even the anchors that holds the house down, or gravity somehow. The force of gravity is cut off. So this is also a Robert Smithson piece, Four-Sided Vortex, almost same year, 65. And of course, this was used to generate the crystals in the animation. And this is also a piece of Robert Smithson that is placed in the cosmos, in the universe, in the 3D animation. But the camera never sees this work, and there are quite a few of these elements that are out there or in there in the crystal world structure, but it's not really present as we see it as the end of on the two leaning screens. So here you also see Eva Hesse, untitled Spider-like Web from the 70s. And I think, yeah, these works that I've always been really fascinated by the spider webs that she worked with for quite a while, but now today, already just 40 years after, it's very hard to see because they're so fragile and falling apart, and that even, and that since it's using this very, at that time, new material, fiberglass, and today it's not strong enough, at least. So Andrei Gasiorek writes, Ballard insists that neither the history of the 20th century and maybe even early 21st century, nor the significant features of the contemporary landscape can probably be grasped in the terms of conventional narrative forms. For Ballard, it is not just a question of cross-breathing genres and unsettling the boundaries between them, but of tackling late 20th century life in literary forms that do justice to our confusions, ambiguities, and unresolved dilemmas. And here these chairs are designed by Lina Bobardi. And of course, Märzbau of Kurt Schwitters looks like a cave that is crystallizing and is. And Kurt Schwitters, once remarked that everything that was of any importance to him was contained in the Märzbau. This statement refers not only to his ideas and overall concept, but also to concrete everyday objects. Souvenirs of friends and other things of sentimental value were stored in niches and later walled in. There were grottos for Miss van der Rohe, a cave for Lisinski, as well as grottos dedicated to abstract things and concepts. Consequently, the Märzbau was a kind of constructed autobiography, a building of personal and historical reminiscences. So Schwitter's grotto became a space for feelings, ideas, and narratives, but narratives without conventional characters. Characters as it is commonly understood in film and novels, like talking heads, or so it's other kinds of see. Here's a detail from the São Paulo Matarazzo Pavilion, Bosco Niemeyer, that appears in the animation as one of the characters, as I spoke about. It is also the space of the São Paulo Biennial, where the piece was firstly shown. So, and here you see Lina Bobardi's house, Casa de Vidro, and Olivia de Oliveira writes about it, that it is a halfway house, half transparent, half opaque, half public, half private, half modern, half traditional, half aerial, half aquatic, half lying on the ground, half standing on pilotes, a house that is frail, temporary, ready to display itself and disappear, a cupboard house or a backpack house where we keep the essentials for life. So going there, I found that the vegetation that had totally changed. The trees were much taller than the house, and the building seemed to be placed in the middle of a jungle. It is as if the house was asked to disappear. As the years go by, the house is in fact losing its importance in relation to its surroundings, nature, the objects it accumulates, and the life that is developed there. Very similar to Smithson's idea of entropy. Yeah, and here you can see her chairs, as you saw them in the animation. So, one other thing to mention is Lina Bobardi's interest in what she called a material unconscious, or the psychic texture of objects. These invisible and vibrant impulses informed her investigations into a site's psychic resonances and became part of her architecture. And I find that very interesting, of course. So maybe this universe, or cosmos, can be seen in the context of Foucault's heterotopic garden as a sort of other space, a paraspace, or utopia. Yeah, here you can see the building flying, floating. Or maybe a dystopia, a reduced world of memories and experiences, seductive and menacing at the very same time. And the references are like characters that are animated or set in motion in a scenography, I mentioned previously that the crystal world is a state of mind. The objects, artworks, and architecture elements and ideas are the protagonists in this mindscape. So I'll introduce the notion of the what-if scenario. Utopia could be described as such a scenario, as one way to address our present political, social, and psychological state through setting up an imaginary alternative. Science fiction as a genre often uses the notion of the what-if scenario. This is why certain issues are addressed almost exclusively in this field. The genre makes a space for speculation, not often found elsewhere, by introducing narratives like, what if time went backwards? What if we could remember everything? What if we are all asleep and dreaming? Or, as in the case of Ursula Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness, what if our gender is not fixed and we can alternate between being male and female almost by will? So I'll just take off this. So this is called Left Hand of Darkness after Ursula Le Guin. It's from 2008. And it's a 3-channel animation that projects a swirl of objects, laid pages of text, choreographed dancing bodies, and a set of anatomical drawings of human genitalia. My point of departure was Ursula Le Guin's 1969 science fiction novel about civilization where gender is provisional and change according to emotional desire. On the journey across a distant intergalactic laser, a man becomes a woman, and mind speech is the language of communication. The animation conjures a 3D world of trans-subjectivity, exchange, and disintegration, as if we were suddenly caught in a dream of I, the bewildered alien protagonist of the story. Past this ticking of pink, brown, and white noise. And here also, these 3 channels are not synchronized, so to see the same, it was continuously change as one image. Sometimes you only see one, other times you see 3. Sometimes it feels as if it goes into a rhythm, and other times it goes out of the rhythm and becomes harder to read. And they overlap so that one image kind of influences the next. And to have an idea of how it works and how much it changes over time, it takes like 41 days for these 3 images again to be next to each other. So sometimes it feels like, it's so pleasant, and so I can feel the beating of the narratives, and then other times it's really disintegrated and very hard to look at. You must have seen it already. I'm sorry. Anyway, Don Haraway has a dream, which is not of a common language, but of building and destroying machines, identities, categories, relationship, space and stories in a sort of spiral dance. And Le Guin also proposes another kind of language, mind speech, which interested me a lot. And I have in my earlier work, or earlier pieces, worked with different concepts of and approaches to language. A language of repetition, looping, layering, and multiple voices. And I see the idea of mind speech as a possibility for a vibrational communication, an imaginary way to transmit information through mental images, some sort of information or a language that is not defined by syntax of beginning, middle, and end. I found it interesting that even what is not heard or seen could be understood as a part of the mind speech language, and wanted to see if layered text could be understood this way. So the speed of the passing pages are varied, and the density of the lines can sometimes make it hard to read, but mostly sentences and words are legible and continues to create new meaning. I don't know now. Okay. So what I made is not so much an attempt to rework scenes of Ursula Le Guin's book, but to create a matrix of associations generated from the notion of a double gender. As you can see here. So the research of the op-ed part of Left Hand of Darkness allude to Bridget Riley, as you can see her placed in her space, so to speak, and also Duchamp's rotary discs. Both are used to create an almost psychedelic or optical architecture, another kind of space for the piece, a place for unknown things to happen. Other references in the work include the experimental film of Maya Deren, Meditation on Violence, and Edgar Allan Poe's A Descent into the Maelstrom. And the map on the top left corner is from 1500, and I grew up just outside the Maelstrom, so the Maelstrom and the way it moves and the experience or the idea of that space was very present for me, and I thought it interesting to see if I could bring it forward through this work. So this is the architecture. Of the space. As I mentioned, my research knows of Maya Deren's, more specifically her film Meditation on Violence, that I choreographed with three dancers, 2 women and a man, made to look like each other to a confusing degree. But also her notes on filmmaking. I just want you to see this a little bit. So we have 3 different people, martial art dancers. And as you can see, they're tattooed with the left hand and one hand, and darkness on the other. Okay. Yeah, so Maya Deren, she proposes what she calls a downward plunge, a vertical structuring of images as an alternative to horizontal development. So more like a continuous fall than a gradually unfolding of linear events. So as you have seen that the idea of trying to somehow structure it differently also is related to the three screens and trying the having the images to fall as well as dive into the next screen, so to speak. And this is another work. It's called Crop Circles from 2010. Since the early 1950s, when rumors of alien encounters in Roosevelt, New Mexico first appeared, the crop circle subculture has grown steadily at the fringes of the cultural landscape. The crop circles, which suddenly materialized as mysterious patterns tattooed into fields and pastures, are presumed to be communications from extraterrestrial intelligences. They usually take the form of abstract signs, messages from science fiction worlds buried deep in space. And the spirit of the past, as well as the aliens of the future, have always spoken through the free spaces available. Seances, dreams of abstract science. In all their otherworldliness, they contain a decidedly emancipatory and revolutionary potential, as you can see here. But maybe the dream of a cosmic revolution could be exchanged for more mundane aspirations and the great leap of consciousness, translated as a desire for greater equality and justice in the world. So for my work at Sørlyst outside of Copenhagen, I created a crop circle that is an elaboration on the well-known feminist symbol, and my intention is not only to infuse feminism with some of the ideas mentioned above, but also to point to feminism as a radically open field for thoughts and experiments. So, yeah. And I'll jump a little bit so that you can get a sense of the different works. But so, if we think of William Burroughs, he said about the cut-up technique, when you cut into the present, the future leaks out. And the multi-layered sound installation, Science Fiction 3114, was produced by cutting up or manipulated the soundtracks of landmark science fiction films like Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville from 1965, François Truffaut, Fahrenheit 451, 1966, Andrei Tarkovsky, Solaris and Stalker, 1972, 1979, and Luc Besson, The Fifth Element, which is a younger sci-fi movie. And yeah, that movie had just some sounds that I needed, but let me see. Continue here. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Science fiction is both science and fiction, or fiction and science. So I see the soundtracks in this installation as a sort of alchemy. The alchemy of breaking up the coherency and the comprehension of the soundtracks and transforming these into a multi-layered mix of signs and omens. I hope that listening to the soundtrack might be compared to predicting the future in a black mirror or coffee ground. I've tried to make the future unknown again, to make it a resource, so to speak. And these are different installations. Here you hardly see the light source. And here we can listen to the soundtrack.
Rouge-gorge, fleuret, lumière d'automne, tendresse aussi.
Защищается от самого себя. Почему? Другой.
Stop it here. So, an earlier sound work based on Kubrick's soundtrack, 2001, A Space Odyssey, was installed in a former chemical depository in Copenhagen. And I see this series of sound works also as on-site audio interventions. As the soundtrack reverberates off of familiar buildings, it establishes a parallel temporal and spatial frame. And I hope to add a speculative use value to these everyday spaces to make a vibrational roadmap of sorts. Kind of possible becomings, maybe. So maybe such a vibrant space would also leave room for what is not being said, and the estranged, and the suppressed, the inhibited. And this is a newspaper clip from an old notebook of mine, I guess from 1980 something, and it's like a space traveler. And here you see the book jackets, the time machine. So I started to collect all these different versions of the same novel, and it's quite interesting to see them together. But these are only two. So the animation Time Machine features a fox-like creature trying to convey its journey into the future. And I emphasize the word try, since it is trapped in a fractal-like mirage, a folding mirror box, as you can see on this image, which ingests certain words and phrases from the creature's explanation. It is both innocent and amorphous, or shapeless, yet its splintered oral transmission is foreboding, implying that something maybe bad is going to happen. But as you can see on this image, and the images I will show you, you could fold the two walls back in so that somehow it would also be trapped in its own space, so to speak. The voice and the narrative are on the edge of collapse. Words are repeated, languages are mixed, both Danish and English, and sentences dissolve, as if this grand journey is equally an uncertain journey into the very words that make up the construction of narrative itself. So here it's crystallizing. And just show you this brief. This was another installation somewhere else. And just
did I leap ahead? There is no difference between time and any of the other dimensions of space.
I'll just have you glimpse into how
And the
it
mystery
installed.
is not whether I have been in the
three times
future, but to believe what I actually found there. Tils Miskina. So I traveled, stopping ever and again, in strides of 1,000 years. Tilsreise, merklich fascination, watching with a strange fascination.
Oh yeah, and then I'll have you.
Did I
listen
leap
to the
ahead?
text.
There is no difference between time and any of the other dimensions of space. And the mystery is not whether I have been in the future, but to believe what I actually found there. Tils Meskina. So I traveled, stopping ever and again, in strides of 1,000 years. Tidsreise. Merklich Fascination. Watching with a strange fascination the sun, Merkur, grow larger and duller. Life slowly ebb away. I stared at the blackness creeping over the day, at the blackness creeping over the day. Blackness, I stared at the blackness creeping over the day and realized that an eclipse was beginning. Mona, Merkur, Morlock. Either the moon or Mercury was passing the disk of the sun. Tils Meskine. Space-time. I took it to be the moon. But later, I have come to believe that what I really saw after solar was the transit of an inner planet passing very near to the Earth. Planeta? Centipede? Et tusen år? My eyes twinkled. My face flushed and animated. I thought of unfathomable distances. Time traveler. Future. The slow drifts, emergent futures, and unknown pasts. In a vibrating soundless hum. Did I leap ahead? There is no
Yeah. It's kind of a. I don't think it knows it can speak. At least it doesn't know what language it speaks. So the creature struggles to recount his journey into paraspace or autopia. Maybe cyberspace is such an autotopia or a psychedelic trip. And a curator commented that the fox reminded him of Brian Wilson from Beach Boys when he speaks about the experiences from the late 60s. But we never know what language, that he does not really know what he says. Anyway, these we'll just jump over. And I guess this is the latest animation. It's called The Oracle, and I worked on it last year, and I'm still working on it. It's still in progress. The title The Oracle has been used. I don't know if that will become the end, the final title, but it takes its cue from Blade Runner, as you could see. So it is a twinned image of a linguistically and visually unstable owl. So the oracle is frequently out of sync with itself as it delivers a monologue of aphorisms and fragments, prophecies from I Ching, as a feminist speaking in tongue. So the soundtrack is from Blade Runner, Ridley Scott's 1982 film adaptation of Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So the sound flow through the owl as if they were trance messages in its sometimes comical and squeaky quest to question notions of self, gender, and identity. And just show you these, and we'll look a little bit more into. And this is another. So the first time I had the two owls, the double owl, or the one owl having its own double placed next to each other. Here they are somehow overlapping shoulder to shoulder, and while they're moving, they somehow also overlap each other. So it's maybe more one having its double just in the back or as a shadow. Oh yeah, actually I wanted you to.
The oracle says there are secrets beneath things, within us, and in the almost human, splitting apart.
Excuse me, I just wanted to see if I could move this forward, but maybe I can't.
The oracle says there are secrets beneath things, within us, and in the almost human, splitting apart. Rachel has revolted. Nexus 6. Building categories. Building relationships. Gender on distant planets. Fire and arousal. 3 times. Making politics in an empty habitat. 4. Wendepunkte. Embrace messiness. Echo, echo, no blame. Deliverance. Embrace messiness. Rachel ascends. Embrace messiness. Embrace messiness.
Yeah. It's quite long, so I will just have you see a little bit. But as you can see here, it's actually standing there waiting, and then as an oracle, it comes through the body. But there is also choreographed.
Het elektrisk voor kæler fra skyggene. Artificial. Fjerne planeter. Ild og optændthed. Speaking in tongues, she plunges into the depth of the city. Dead machines. Dust early morning. Fire in the lake. Talk of revolution. The struggle must be carried on. The struggle must be carried on. When the oracle speaks, it is the voice of a trickster. It is the voice of a trickster.
Lislegaard. It's artificial. It's artificial.
Artificial.
Of course it is. Of course it is. I'm Rachel. I'm Rachel.
Rachel? Rachel.
I'm Rachel.
May I ask you a personal question? Have you ever encountered a human by mistake?
And it continues. Let's see. But the last part here is choreographed from the film itself. Maybe some of you recognized it. It's Rachel asking if he likes the owl, and he says, of course. And she asks if it's artificial. And he says also, of course. So this body and machine somehow is continuously part of the next works that I'm working on. But I think I'll stop here. Maybe I can, as the final comment, I will read this little note from Smithson's, tangled jungles, blind paths, secret passages, lost cities invade our perception. The sights in film are not to be located or trusted. All is out of proportion. Scale inflates or deflates into uneasy dimensions. We are lost between the abyss between us and the boundless horizon outside us. And it's a cinematic utopia. Yeah, that's the old.
Any questions?
It's late.
I thought that was fascinating, and a lot of what you talked about in relation to science fiction and your work seemed to me to have something to do with, as I think you described it yourself, the relation of the historical and the cosmic. And you can see one kind of relation in the earlier, in the works by other artists you talked about, like Ballard and Smithson, that seems to have something to do with the period from the war into the Cold War, and some kind of relationship also with things like moon landings, the nuclear threat, analog mass media, whatever, that whole set of conditions of that period. And then in your work, you're also dealing with that relationship, the relationship between, a historical dimension and sort of non-historical or cosmic elements that have effects or have some kind of relationship with that. I wondered if you feel that relationship has changed, that relationship between the cosmic and the historical, between the 1960s to the 70s that you're drawing on, and what you're doing now, and also in relation to the different technologies that you're using, particularly obviously digital, but maybe also ecological or in other senses. And how, if that's reflected in your work, do you think?
Yeah. I guess it is, of course, when I don't know if I can answer it so clearly, but I don't. These works are mostly. They are not illustrations of any of the literary references as I see it. It's mostly some few ideas that I somehow, when reading them again, think I want to reread it or restage it or bring those ideas forward into a different kind of structure. Maybe not to say one thing, but to somehow reactivate some of these ideas. And of course, it depends a little on which writer you you want to talk about, but they all have very different agendas. And Ursula Le Guin is, of course, it's the 60s and 70s, it's gender issues, and it's very much this feeling of, coping with not only biological terms, but also the construction of life and the construction of being together and the construction of gender politics, and also you could even say in Ballard the construction of life and death. That kind of is there an in-between space that is not spoken about. So yeah, I think it is different today than it was then, but I do think that some of the ideas that they brought up is still not really maybe understood, or maybe they need to be reactivated, to somehow have a chance to be looked at again. I don't know if that answers your question, but the air is really dense. It feels as if the day was very long for those of you who stayed up hours.
Thank you. It's very stimulating. You seem to move from the beginning to very spatially orientated images with no definite objects that one was moving through space, and clearly at the end, very specific objects. And I wondered if that was a sort of conscious trajectory in the work. And you had you talked about heterotopic space, and then you seem to have these objects which were maybe not heterotopic, but kind of multiple personality in a way. And is that just the structure of your talk, or a trajectory of in your practice?
Well, I think it's always, when you see a little part of the works, it can seem to jump quite radically from one idea to the other. But said very simplified, you could say that working with 3D animation, as I'm sure many of you also do and have done, making architectural models, to create, how can you say, characters or creatures or human beings in such a world is very complicated also. Maybe even more complicated. And I think in these first works that I showed here, I was not in need of a human being or like a subject in the usual sense. I wanted somehow to see if these ideas that are generated, of course, when you see the work, you would not know probably about Lina Bo Bardi and the architects that are being referenced, but I wanted to see if these ideas that are taken from them could somehow activate another read and then become the how can you say, the active elements as if they were characters in this universe at least. And the last few works that I showed you, it's so complicated to create these animals. And if you knew how badly they look from the backside, I don't know if I would even dare to show it to you. But it's also, I try to somehow, when I work with digital technology, not to want it to be perfect. I just want it to somehow bring forward, in these cases, ideas of politics of language, politics of gender, and that somehow I try to keep the focus there and then stop when I can see it has the potential. But I'm sure that in a few years it will be so much easier to create these creatures, even if it's a human being or other animals. But yeah, it is. They look different, and though I think it's, for me, it's always like a struggle to continue develop new ways of using technology, but also ideas, bring them forward. So.
But it opens up a very different sort of space for me as a spectator. The first one, I felt I'm being sucked into some other space, whereas the others I'm having a dialogue with someone who's experienced it.
Yeah, and that maybe, I can see what you mean. I mean, but for me, the works that I did before, the first one was very language-based, as I said, working with a voice as a looping, having a looping force, having it, multiple layered. And for me, it was important to somehow bring those works also into the animated arena And I guess that's what I'm doing. And still, I would say that when you see the creature, the fox, in Time Machine, it is very much. It has a linear structure, but it has these jumps. So if you do not speak Danish, there is this wish that you would not know what is about, the unknown somehow, and also the voice is still it doesn't come clearly out of the body. So I think. Yeah, now I forgot where I started and where I wanted to end, but at least that it has a reference, maybe not to the works here, but earlier works that I thought was important, and also that you somehow get sucked into the mirror and into that kind of spatial construction in another way. And I think actually also with the owl, but I haven't finished it yet, but I was much more happy when it was not as monumental, being the double of itself. So.
Well, thank you for a very interesting visual presentation. I see the work. I hear you intermittently talk about gender and gender issues, but I'm not quite sure what kind of gender issues you're trying to present in the work. I mean, how do you see the gender issue? Do you see it as a conflict? You've talked about gender politics. Do you see this as a kind of unresolved conflict? And if so, how is this personified in the work?
Oh, that's a big... well, I see it, I guess, gender issues. You can... I think politics in general can always be said, have a phrase being black and white, it's either men or women, but I think it's much more complex. And I think that these themes and these politics, so to speak, is hiding so much more than is revealed already. And I guess that the notion of them is somehow important for me, and I think I always try to somehow reactivate them in ways I not even know the result of, so to speak. I guess with the voice, what is a male and what is a female voice, already there are these issues that are brought forward, and language as a very limited form of speaking about what we call the reality or the real world. I see that it's so much more complex, so it's very hard to do that with language as we use it, or maybe I used to use it. So I guess that I always hope that the complexity is more present, and maybe the unresolved of the dilemmas are more present than actually the resolved issue of gender. And for example.
So it's not the obvious political issues that you're interested in, but something much more profound, much more perhaps we could call, say, subconscious, which is embodied in the whole way in which we understand our identity.
Yeah, I guess we can say it. It's more psychological also. But immediately if you define the psychological term, I mean, there's much to find, but it's also so much more, and I guess that's my thing. That I don't have a resolved idea of what it is and how it could, how it could look like. So yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think on the question of gender, where it seemed to me extremely kind of distinct the way you kind of approach it, which is really, and I suppose it's related to kind of science fiction. The issue for you really is that the question of gender is like epic. I mean, as if it belongs to the issue of epic. So it's not surprising in a sense. I mean, maybe antagonism in epic always takes a kind of something of a kind of sadomasochistic form, which it obviously does kind of in the drawings that you put up. That was one thing. But there was something which I don't know quite how to ask the question. It starts from the observation that when you showed the film of a certain kind of Latin American modernist architecture, it's strange that it looks almost unbearably still in the future. I mean, you know, although on the one hand it's happened, has been conceived, and was and is in the world, it seems to belong to a kind of a future which hasn't sort of, in which the relationships between time and space will be fundamentally reorganized. I mean, it makes one wonder whether the problem of modernist architecture is precisely that it required a fundamental reorganization of time and space, which we can't do. Architects not actually, unlike how they feel, not actually being God. And that has something to do, I think, then with the curious reverse of that, the kind of imagery you get in something like Blade Runner, which always, no matter what you see, even if it's high-tech, looks irreversibly Victorian in some sense. And so I think, you know, that at the graphic level, there are really important questions of the marking of temporality, which I really liked.
Yeah, I guess with the anthropic part of especially the architecture from Brazil, it's what I was struck by when I was there is also how different in many ways modernism in South America is from European modernism, even though they used to have the same. I mean, Corbusier was also very influential on the architecture there, but for some reason I think time is passing by much faster because of the jungle and the humidity. So the buildings, I mean, as in Brasilia, the city that was built in 4 years, is already falling apart so strongly. But, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's because nature and architecture hate each other.
Exactly. Or maybe we need to embrace that falling apart.
Is there a last question or statement?
Thanks very much for the talk. This probably won't be a very good question, but you're obviously very, very good at CGI. You've got
At what?
computer-generated images. Is that CGI? I don't know. Well,
I'm not so good at it, to be honest.
Whatever. It's really slick and it's really really good. But say if your animation skills were rubbish, and you produced stuff that looked like South Park. So you had like an owl talking that looked like a really basic sort of cartoon. Would your work lose the sense of power and meaning to it if it was not very well executed?
No, I think actually, I mean, to be honest, my skills are quite low, and I always appreciate just the basics of it. And you said it was slick, but for me, it's the basic as I see computer games. So it's the way it looks. It is the basic formations that animation brings forward. If I want it to be much more elaborate, I need to know much more than I do to have the walls of the architecture, for example, look like the materiality that we maybe think of when we think of one building or one room. So I don't see it being slick. I see it more to this kind of low-key computer game kind of look. And but the animals, I don't think it will change in its meaning or what I somehow put into the owl. But of course, imageries. I don't know. Still, when I look at the fox and when I look at the owl, I always wish it to look different than it does. So maybe I haven't found the way it should look, but it's always, you have to start somewhere, and then you start maybe with thinking of it as a body. You have the skeleton and the bones, and you try to build it from inside out, and maybe it's easier if you build it or you cut it out from the outside in, or maybe think of it more like cartoon imageries. But it's also very easy to have it look like Disney, and I don't want to end up having it Disney-like. So it's to find something in between, but I'm still working on it, I would say.
Okay, yeah. Would you feel like you would radically change your style of working in the future, or would you do? Because it seems conceptually there's so much stuff going into each piece. Whereas I was thinking, like, if you're looking at works by Smithson, they usually have a very simple kind of experience, a jetty that's going in a spiral into a salt lake, and that what that's doing is it confuses when you're walking down it, it's like the water's solidifying and the land is liquefying. There's a sense of this kind of confusion being created from a very, very simple idea. But so how could you move? How would you move from one idea to the next? And I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm asking. It's just an observation.
I don't know what to answer, but it's absolutely conceptually based. But I could show you this one, which is actually it's one crystal that I was able to borrow from a Smithson piece called 8-unit piece that the museum in Copenhagen owns. So, I mean, it's 8 big circles with crystals, and I got this tiny little one with me home, and I made a drawing of it exactly as it is, and then I had it fall. And then the funny thing, when it falls, if you see, sometimes it falls and there comes this kind of strange after image. And you can see it. I think and it just continuously falls and falls and falls and falls, very simply. But it has this after image, which I was kind of fascinated by, and I wanted it to somehow. Let's see if it comes. There it is. And this is just also what happens when you work with animation, that somehow one thing is the object itself, and then it's the space, and then it's the camera, and then it's the sequence of time. And there are so many elements that has to be organized together, and I always have this sense that it also has its own, system that I cannot really control. And these kind of after images also just happen to be a false image that I could hardly see when I looked into the universe, and I had to click on all the buttons to somehow get there to see that it was another lamp that somehow mirrored itself twice, and that's why it came back there. So, yeah, what is the next idea, and what makes the next idea? Sometimes sometimes it's very related to where I will, or which work I will show, and also the thoughts I think would be interesting to dive more into. So,
I think we have exhausted you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for being so patient. And I can see that it's warmer in the back than up here, actually.